What up? Welcome to the morning drive. Today we're going to be doing we're going to be talking about false prophets. A second video on false prophets. So I want to real quick read two Bible verses and then we'll start the drive. All right. So we're looking at Luke 24, verse 27. Now Jesus, this is after his death, burial, and resurrection. He rolled up on these cats and they didn't believe it was him. And then they finally did. And he says, now it says, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Jesus basically explained to these cats. So when it says in beginning at Moses and all the prophets, that basically means all the prophets of the Old Testament, right? All the books that start with a name like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, right? All of those books. There's a lot of them in the Old Testament, major and minor prophets. And then when it says beginning at Moses, that just means he's talking about the Old Testament, right? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, because those were written by Moses. So that's what it means when the New Testament refers to Moses. It either refers to him, Moses the person, or it refers to Moses as the books that were written by Moses, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then I want to read Mark. And I want to read, this is the Great Commission. This is right before Jesus ascends into heaven. And he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So those are the two main Bible verses that I want you to keep in mind while this discussion is taking place. So, given those two things, I want to talk about false prophets. And what I want to talk about is how easy it is to spot a false teacher, false prophet, any of that. My last video I did on false prophets, I'm really happy with that one. Basically a false prophet will entice his followers or listeners using methods that the world uses, right? Preaching the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. So another thing that we got to watch out for when it comes to false prophets, false teachers, all that, is peripheral issues. And a lot of times you'll hear the word doctrine used, because all these theologians and highbrow type intellectuals, or pseudo-intellectuals anyway, they've basically redefined doctrine to mean a bunch of prepositional statements that are based more on a bunch of prepositional statements that are based more on philosophy, and then they use the Bible to as a reference to sort of bolster, with proof texts, bolster their philosophy. That's what the theological definition of doctrine has become. But really, all that doctrine is, if you respect the definition, the historical definition, and the actual definition of the word doctrine, all it means is a practice. Like here's what we're going to practice. Here's what we're going to do. So it's just a mode of operation, or an operation that is going to be carried out. That's all doctrine is practice. And a lot of people get that all mixed up and think that it's a bunch of propositional phrases, or just basically propositions. And 90% of the time, the propositions aren't biblical. They use proof text to bolster those. Anyhow, so what we see with those two verses that I read is Jesus explain to these cats that the Old Testament is all about him, right? And then you also see Jesus giving the Great Commission, and that is go in to all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So here's an easy way to know that you are being misled, and it is peripheral issues. Okay, so there are only two sermons. There are only two sermons, and that is it. And all of real Christianity, not all these like TV preachers with, $26 million mansions and millions of people watching them on TV, and they go on Oprah and they have this big fake smile. I'm not talking about phony Christians or wolves in sheep's clothing. I'm talking about real Christians. For real Christians, there were only two sermons. The one sermon points to Jesus Christ. It points to the gospel, right? It talks about sin, the need for righteousness, and the judgment of God, and how you can avoid the judgment of God through Jesus Christ, right? How you can be shown mercy, how you can be saved. And that is the gospel. And even Christians need to hear the gospel over and over and over again. So that is the one Christian message right there. That's one of the two. Hold on a minute. And the only other, and now what I mean by that is basically from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, sermons that point to Jesus Christ. Right? There's another verse that says the law was the schoolmaster that led us to Christ. The law is basically like the Levitical law and the Mosaic law, the Ten Commandments and the laws, all the laws written in like the book of Leviticus, stuff like that, right? It said it was the schoolmaster that led us to Christ. So everything, including the Ten Commandments, including the law, the Old Testament, everything in the Bible points to Jesus, right? So if you hear some sermon that's caught up on peripheral issues and it's using the Bible, right? So a peripheral issue is like a sermon about how you can get a promotion at work, or right? Because this is the American Christianity nowadays that's completely phony. Is the like self-help success sort of version of Christianity, where it's like everyone's obsessed with how they can apply the Bible to their own lives and make their lives better somehow, right? Every Bible verse is like, well, how do I overcome this problem? Or how do I get a promotion at work? Or how is God gonna make me prosper and get, the American dream and the house that I want and the car that I want? How can this Bible verse help me lose 5 pounds or whatever, right? I mean, these are peripheral issues. You'll see other peripheral issues, more like in the Pentecostal thing, where they're kind of obsessed with what's called speaking in tongues, or miracles, signs and wonders, stuff like that. Those are peripheral issues. Those are issues that are in the Bible, that the Bible mentions, but they go out of their way to be hyper-focused on these things instead of Jesus Christ. So those are all peripheral issues, right? When you watch like Joel Osteen and he's telling you some Bible verse, and he's not pointing to Christ, he's pointing to how God is going to get you a raise at work, or, how God is going to somehow improve your life. Those are peripheral issues. So essentially, that is one way to spot a false teacher right away, even though they appear so pious and they're on TV and everyone, all these other, Christians are giving them all this respect, and, they're writing, they have all these books published and this and that. a real easy way to spot a false teacher is they give an entire sermon and they're not pointing you to Jesus Christ. They're not talking about sin. They're not talking about righteousness. They're not talking about Jesus. They're talking about some other issue beyond that, and they're using the Bible to do it. That's a peripheral issue, and that's a real easy way to spot false teachers. Anyone who gives a sermon and does not point to Christ, but is talking about some other side issue and using the Bible to do it, that's a false prophet, a false teacher, because we saw where Jesus himself, and he's our example, right? Jesus himself talks to these cats on the after his death, burial, and resurrection, and he basically reveals the fact to them that the entire Old Testament all points to him. And we know the New Testament is about Jesus, right? That's obvious. So the entire Bible is all about Jesus. Nothing else. And now you'll see a few epistles where they address some peripheral issues. And the reason they do that, like Paul with the Corinthians, right? When they're getting all almost like the Pentecostal church today, they're all obsessed with tongues and miracles and prophecy, and they're all just disorderly in church and this and that. And Paul addresses this issue. Well, that's because he has to correct them because they're getting off track. You know what I'm saying? So that you will see epistles address issues like that in the Bible, but a sermon, like if you look at sermons in the Bible, now look at you're gonna look at like Stephen and look at Paul in the book of Acts, right? There's two really good sermons, and then you look at the Sermon on the Mount, right? Which is a sermon by Jesus. All of those sermons, all three of those sermons use different methods, but they all point to Christ. They all point to Jesus. So the second type of sermon that is a legit Christian sermon, and this is just like the law, right? Jesus sums up the law, and he says, this is the whole of the law, right? He says that you love the Lord your God and that you love your neighbor as yourself, right? So there's a God-oriented part of the law, which is basically like the first the first 4 commandments out of the 10, right? Are all oriented towards God. And then you see the last 6 of the 10 commandments are all oriented towards man relating with man, right? It's loving your neighbor as yourself sums up the last 6 of the 10 commandments. So we're going to see the same thing with these 2 different types of sermons. We're going to see one that points towards Christ, which is God, right? And then we're going to see another sermon where, you see the Great Commission in Mark there, where Jesus says, go into all the earth and preach the gospel to every creature. So what we're going to see, the other legit Christian sermon you're going to see is one that is spurning Christians to go out and point to Christ. So, and that's it, to go out and to preach the gospel, right? To go soul winning, to love your neighbor as yourself, If you love your neighbor and your neighbor's not saved and you haven't shared the gospel with them, then you don't love your neighbor as yourself, right? Essentially, you are neglecting your neighbor because your neighbor's going to go to hell. So those are the 2 legit Christian sermons. Now, obviously, there's going to be different ways that people are going to point to Christ. And there's going to be different ways that Christians, teachers and preachers and stuff like that, motivate other Christians to go soul winning, to go preach the gospel to every person, right? So, you gotta use your filter and kind of understand that everyone's going to preach these messages in a different way. Some of them are going to talk about sin, right? You're going to hear, especially a lot of good Baptist preachers, you're going to hear them preaching against sin. Well, the Bible says the law is the schoolmaster that led us to Christ, right? So, of course, preaching against sin is ultimately because you're pointing to the fact that people are unrighteous and that they need Jesus Christ. They need to have faith in Jesus, that he died on the cross and took the punishment for our sins and then rose again on the third day to prove that it was legit, that his claims were legit, right? So that's basically, you're going to see people preaching against sin, or you're going to see something like that. Those aren't peripheral issues. Those are all part of pointing people to Jesus, right? So you just got to use your filter and stuff like that, and your discernment, and ask yourself, what is the, everybody has basically like reading comprehension skills, right? You take a test when you're in school, you read like a paragraph, and then it'll say, what was the topic of this paragraph, right? Something like that. So, and you need to do the same thing when you're listening to sermons. You need to listen to a sermon by a certain preacher or whatever, whoever it is, and listen very carefully to what they're saying. And then ultimately ask yourself, this is how you critique and decide for yourself who's a false teacher and who's not. Ask yourself, did this person ultimately, was the subject of this sermon to point me, a Christian, to look to Christ, to rely on Christ, or to point the unbeliever to put their trust in Jesus Christ and the work he did on the cross and that he rose again, right? So ask yourself, just like you're a kid and you're taking a reading comprehension class or a test, and ask yourself, what is the main subject of this sermon? Is it pointing to Jesus, or is it pointing to other Christians and spurning them and encouraging them to go out and point people to Jesus? Because those are the two primary messages that a true prophet of God will preach, is look to Jesus, or he will encourage other people to go out and preach the gospel, right? So either way, it's pointing to Jesus Christ. And basically that's it. You want to spot a false prophet, ask yourself, what is the main subject of this sermon that I'm listening to? And if it is not Jesus Christ, or hey Christians, get off your lazy butts and go preach the gospel and reach the unreached, if it's not one of those two types of sermons, then most likely the person who's teaching it is a false teacher. That's pretty easy, right? Pretty easy to understand, pretty simple stuff. And that's all I wanted to talk to you guys about today, is just, it's not like the, what's that Janis Joplin song? Have you guys ever heard that Janis Joplin song? Lord, please buy me a Mercedes-Benz. That's a bunch of garbage. And there's a lot of preachers out there who that's the subject of their sermons, is, what God can do for you. It's almost like the JFK speech where he says, ask not what you can do for your country, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. In the same token, you're not going to hear all these sermons about all these wonderful things, these worldly things God could get you or do for you or whatever, or doctrinal things, these where they'll use a preposition, let's say something like limited atonement, or something, and they go off on this whole doctrine where Jesus didn't die for everyone or something like that. These are peripheral issues, and they're basically lies from Satan, and these false doctrines about God's going to get you a Mercedes, or whatever it is. If it's not about Jesus, and it's not about telling other people to point to Jesus, telling Christians to go out there and preach the gospel, then it's not a legit sermon and the person isn't from God. That's just straight up. And I know that well, there's all these technicalities and everything that people try to do, but I'm going to tell you straight up, that's it. You know what I mean? And we'll get further in depth. Now, is it okay for like some buddies to get together and like discuss, their views on certain things, on issues in the Bible and things like that, and talk about them and what they think something means versus another person and this and that? Of course it is. I'm not saying, that you can't talk about anything but Jesus in the Bible or whatever, but these people who are given like platforms, who are preaching sermons and teaching people and stuff like that, if they're claiming to be a teacher and they're claiming to be called of God, and they're not pointing you to Christ, or they're not spurning other Christians or encouraging other Christians to go out and preach the gospel, then their sermon is false and they're not from God. And there's a lot of those. All right? Almost every church you walk into in this country is full of wolves in sheep's clothing. It's basically westernized Christianity. It's an American version of Christianity, and it's completely false and terrible. Anyway, that's what I want to talk to you guys about. So, Jesus in the Old Testament, Jesus in the New Testament, right? There's a lot of people that'll, one of the doctrines, the big doctrines out there is dispensationalism. And they'll go through the Old Testament and they'll start talking about how God promised Israel this land and blah, blah, blah. And he hasn't fulfilled the promise all the way. And they'll get Christians caught up in these political issues because they listen to someone who was preaching a peripheral sermon, a sermon about peripheral issues like Israel or whatever. And then that's why you have a bunch of Christians nowadays listen to these false teachers, and the next thing you know, they're caught up in the Fox News garbage and the Zionist garbage, and they're, all these Christians are pro-war. It's freaking nuts, dude, right? These guys are idiots because they got caught up listening to a false teacher who taught things from the Old Testament that weren't pointing to Christ, right? The Old Testament is all about Jesus, not about how we need to go to war in the Middle East or whatever. These John Hagee people or whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous. This guy literally signed his autograph on a bomb that was going over somewhere to be dropped in the Middle East. And he calls himself a Baptist. This is sad. And it's people who give this guy a platform, right? Because they're listening to people, to false prophets who give sermons and teachings on peripheral issues and not using the Old Testament to point people to Christ, using the New Testament to point people to Christ, or encouraging Christians to go point people to Christ. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. Leave some comments, dude. If you guys have a criticism or some feedback. Anyway, thanks a lot, guys.